So we were talking about documentation, and that kind of breaks down into documentation within the code base for other programmers and people who want to hop on board and contribute, and as well as sort of top-level documentation of RChain and the whole RChain. And so we were saying we should probably have a github.io page. So corresponding to the GitHub, it's a lot of projects have a page where they can do announcements, blog posts, things like that. And we want to do that. And then we want to, kind of like we were talking about the other day, where we introduced RChain by starting with a cell and then building up to all these different higher level concepts. We thought that that would make a good sort of ongoing posts, blog posts that later could be maybe turned into, you know, RChain by example, a book, right? So to drill down into some of the specifics, so an intro to RChain docs for new users, that's what I was just talking about. Clearly defined feature list for examples. So what are the features that we're presenting and what are some examples of those features? Here we're talking about maybe writing some documentation for ourselves to just kind of spec out the pieces that are still not entirely determined. So we talked a little bit about the total functional sublanguage, whether that's going to be kind of another piece or if it's going to be embedded into RChain. And recognition and optimization of that. So we want to write some documentation to just clarify our ideas on that. We want to, right now in the GitHub, there are a lot of repos, and really the only one of importance to us is the RChain repo, which has a bunch of sub-projects. And we want to make sure that we add sort of notes to the other repos. We can keep them around, but we want to add readmes so that it's clear that these are either deprecated or not the main project, that kind of thing. We want to have very good project and module overviews. So talking again about the RChain repo, it has a bunch of sub-projects, right? So we want each of those sub-projects to have a README and to explain the purpose of that sub-project. Additionally, we want good documentation on what each module in those sub-projects is doing, what its purpose is. So we talked about the types that we want to spec out, the type logic for Mercury. So that's not going to be full behavioral spatial types, but this namespace logic paper has the ideas on what the type theory there is going to be. Implementation architecture diagram. I'm not sure I remember what that was. Okay. Okay. We need some beautiful graphics. Okay. Row Scala. So this is the VM structure. So we want to definitely document that and explain how, for instance, it would probably be good in the documentation to have some examples of how RChain gets compiled down to row Scala. Yeah, exactly. Well, now that he's learned it, he can write some excellent documentation for us. So we talked about like github.io. So we have the RChain co-op page, and that's good for like community and business and explaining kind of what the project is about. But if we want to get more into like blog posts and kind of developer friendly stuff, I think a github.io page is a good idea. We want to make sure we have readme.mds in all of our sub projects and in the top level project. And that readme needs to include installation guide. It needs to be dead simple for any new user to install. And even if that's just like SBT install, like we need to write that and we need to link to the tool chain that they need in order to be able to do that. Use, so we need some examples and descriptions of using any subproject. And then links to documentation. So There's a Scala docs, I guess, that you can run on your code base to generate nice documentation. We should make sure that looks good. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then there's a question of whether some of this documentation should be literate. Literate just means that in addition to just being something human readable, it's something you could run as a program. And that gives you kind of a sanity check as well as making it easy for new users to get started.
In particular, tests were floated as potentially being literate. That if your test fails in the literate thing, it becomes really obvious.
Yes, so I'm going to talk about that in a sec. Where did we put that? Okay, so here we were talking about so right now I've been talking about kind of top level documentation, but within the code base itself, we want to have very good coverage of the documentation, and we want examples, we want properties, we want all those things to be documented. In addition, we want to use SBT doc test, which will ensure that, first of all, anytime you write a documentation, it also becomes a test, so it's double purpose. And secondly, that the documentation never gets out of sync with the actual code. So it's always checked. So your documentation is always tested. And that's, I think, going to be very, very good. Preamble, so like in the top of every module, we should talk about, so when I said, we need to talk about what the project does and what each module does, it makes sense to put that in a preamble in the module, and any other information we want to include that's relevant. And okay, so then we need docs to describe our storage and docs to describe our network protocol. I'm not sure. So I guess standard lib is probably the library that we're going to build in Erlang for developers who want to build their own smart contracts. They don't need to do everything from scratch. They're going to have some pieces. A lot of this stuff we kind of segued into talking about the language design, and but also like specking, right? Specking is also kind of part of documentation. So we want to kind of, as we are designing, make sure that we update the spec, that it's clean, that it's readable to everyone, and that it's checked by more than one person. So that's what we're talking about here is problem documentation. So we have all these kind of things that we haven't quite resolved yet. We have a lot of great ideas, but we need to write up those ideas and not just put them on the whiteboard and then erase them. Okay. In particular, how are we dealing with crypto? How are we dealing with the total functional sublanguage? How are we dealing with data types, specifically algebraic data types? How do we want to support them? What is the syntax with which we want to support them? Should it be just Archon, or should we have a separate ADT system? Namespaces, of course, we've been stuck on that for a day or two. Rosette has a notion of arrival of messages, so potential for having continuation or message doesn't read first or both. I don't remember what that was.
So Joe was pointing out that because of the nature of the Rosette VM, there's the possibility that you can have multiple chunks of data and multiple continuations that simply are sleeping and haven't woken up yet. So usually what happens is we put the continuation in and then poke it to say, hey, go see if you can combine with any of these waiting data items. We could postpone that in some situations. It seemed at least as reasonable as the various options you had in Special K for consume versus linear versus whatever else. So for instance, when you're deploying a contract, you know there's no data waiting for it yet. Don't even bother looking, sort of thing.
Problems and ideas that we had, we should write them down and store them.
One thing that occurs to me, hopefully we would like to have a very advanced macro system that takes advantage of the reflection. We might put some pressure on that by writing a kind of a spec or a toy for the total functional down to Rolang that way, and then as it gets more solid, we push it as deep as possible. I would want that to be super optimized. So, down in the implementation, like
Macro systems go very well with this notion of reflectivity, so it's probably a good idea to use that as a test ground for reflective.
And so the one thing that I had proposed to you earlier was recognizing that a particular process is spatially typed, that we're just looking at the structure of the process, and if it does that, then we optimize it. It wouldn't catch all functions, but it would catch a certain class of functions. Right, yeah.
I would personally say don't prematurely optimize. It's always a danger.
I'm saying down the road, these contracts need to screen, right? If we're going to do big data, we're going to do financial analytics, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and because total functional processes don't change their semantics other than the spatial types, what the structure looks like, we can toss in the structural equivalents of arithmetic expressions, for example, or any other total function of those before sending. So it reduces to its value, and then you send just the value across. Yeah. And this last point, the question was how to use object capabilities on the blockchain. If you don't do something, then all the names are public, and you can't, hide authority from some party by keeping the name from them, because they can just go look it up. On the other hand, if you want to embed some public name into your contract, you can't just go through in the compile phase and replace all the names. So having some way of denoting private names versus public names, if we're using new, then that is an already existing syntax for private names, and those are ones that we can take an @p name and turn it in an @p_q name, so that you can't ever name the thing that the other guy was using directly.
What is Archon? I've heard of Arson, but not Archon.
Archon is Arson, but if you put a little squiggly under the C, then it's like garçon.
Oh, it's very subtle.
It's the RChain object notation.